Greetings, everyone. Russ Barkley here. And guess what? I've got a new camera and a new headset with microphone. Much better. It's not the 20-year-old stuff that I was using to create all the other earlier videos on this channel. So thanks and a shout out to Hans in Germany for writing to me and suggesting that I improve my game. So that's what I'm trying to do. I hope you find the new sound and new images to be more to your liking. In this presentation, I want to talk about a concept that I developed more than 20, 30 years ago, at least, with regard to the attitude that parents should take toward raising a child with ADHD. I began to realize early on in my private practice that ADHD children and their parents were in a great deal of conflict with each other, of course. And although a lot of that had to do with the child's difficulties with self regulation, I began to discover, as I counseled thousands of parents on ADHD, that the parents' framework or stance that they took toward their role as a parent was also part of the problem. And so I developed this idea that parents are shepherds and not engineers. And by that, I mean that you don't get to design your kids to be exactly as you want them to be. They come to you with many traits and qualities as they develop. And a large part of what we do with them is to shepherd them into adulthood. Now, this idea, first of all, was brought to my attention through the many studies of the genetics of children's personality, intelligence, specifically neurodevelopmental disorders, and especially ADHD. We were seeing across countless studies of inheritance, of twin studies, of children who were adopted away versus children who were raised by their biological parents, and so on. And all of this information was coming together to suggest that parents don't get to design the child they're going to have through the way they parent and manage their household and so on. Parents were coming to us with this idea, I think unquestioned, that how my child is going to turn out in virtually every aspect that's important in their life has a lot to do with me and how I'm raising them. And as a result, this was leading to parents, first of all, becoming overly involved in the parent's role, what you call a helicopter parent. It also was leading to parents feeling very guilty if their children went on to develop particular disorders or disabilities, specifically like ADHD, for instance. And so we were left with this problem that parents had come to the role of parenting with the wrong framework, in my opinion, relative to what science was telling us is largely contributing to children's characteristics, traits, and to some extent, their outcomes. So I began to cast around for what's a simple way of conveying to parents that I was counseling what their framework, what their stance to parenting ought to be, rather than what it was that they were coming in with, which was the role of a parent as an architect, an engineer, a builder, somebody who constructs their child out of this mass of clay, if you will. Children were viewed as tabula rasas, to quote an earlier philosopher, and we could determine who they were going to be by the way we raised them. And this idea is long-standing, that parents determine outcomes. It's been going on ever since people wondered about how do we create, how do we make good children. But it was flying in the face of an ever accumulating amount of research that was showing what the main factors were in determining the broad traits and characteristics of our children. So that's when I hit upon this idea that the best way to frame the role of a parent, particularly to a child with a neurodevelopmental disorder, is that you're a shepherd, not an engineer, not an architect, not a chef who gets to combine these ingredients, but more like a shepherd. So let's examine some of the basics behind this view of parents as shepherds. First of all, let's understand that your child is a unique combination of your family's extended genetic traits. So your child is this very unusual combination of all of the genetics that determine their physical and psychological traits, all wrapped up in this novel combination we call this child. So, our children aren't just a reflection of each parent and who they are, but parents bring with them a lot of genetics from their relatives that may or may not be being expressed in them, but might well become expressed in the child and their phenotype, if you want the scientific term for it. So we need to start looking at children as unique events, so to speak, that are an amalgamation, a mosaic of a lot of the unique traits that come down to us through our families. Now, this unique combination of genetic traits then goes on to interact with our family environment and our community environment. And that interaction makes our child even more unique as an individual. There's no one else like them in terms of these combinations of genetics with environment. And further, our child is going to go on and interact with relatively unique events outside the home and to some extent inside the home by virtue of where we choose to live, where they go to school, the neighbors that surround us, the resources available that our child can interact with in that community. These unique events. And some of those unique events are, unfortunately, going to be biological ones that have to do with exposure to diseases, to poisons, to accidental injuries and traumas and other things that are outside of our control largely, but are also going to make an impression or imprint on this child and their neurodevelopment, if you will. So it's a quite a unique combination of genetics with environments that leads to the child that we have. And so you don't get to design a child from an intention, a blueprint. You instead are given this gift of this unique individual, and you get to raise them. So our child comes with hundreds of traits, abilities, talents, deficits as well, that are largely not of our doing as parents. Our job is to take what we're given and do the best we can with it and try to create outcomes where we have some influences, but realize that we don't get to determine everything and that a lot of things are outside of our control. So your role as a parent is much closer to that of a shepherd than it is to that of an engineer, architect, or sculptor who gets to take raw materials and create whatever they like out of that material. We simply don't get to do that. This idea has been echoed since the 1960s by people like Richard Bell when he talked about children having more of an influence on their parents' behavior than parent behavior was having on that child. Later, Sandra Scar, the president of the Society for Research in Child Development, made the same point, and that is that children come to us with these unique combinations of genetic and biological attributes, and that as long as we provided a good enough environment and most environments are good enough, our children would grow and develop, much more like a seed of a tree that's planted and contains within it all of the characteristics needed to create that unique tree. The same is true about our children. It was said again by Judith Harris in her book in the 1990s, The Nurture Assumption, and again later in 2002 by the eminent psychologist Steven Pinker in his book, The Blank Slate. All of these people were making the same claims and assertions that the role of parenting and the influence of parenting on the outcomes of children is fairly limited. We're not saying there isn't one. I'm not saying, as one parent accused me of saying after I gave this speech for the first time, when they said, well, Russ, aren't you just saying that we should just leave them a loaf of bread and go to Las Vegas? Well, of course not. That's not what shepherds do. That's neglectful. That's like a shepherd saying, I'm not even going to show up in the pasture to look after these sheep. Of course not. Don't be silly. But instead, what I'm saying is understand your role and the limits of your role, and you'll find yourself not only doing a better job, but actually enjoying the children that you've been given to raise as a shepherd. So let's take a look at some of the things that make for good shepherding as a parent. First of all, there are the obvious roles that shepherds play, which is to provide protection to these, if you will, young, as yet undeveloped individuals who need our guidance and protection, and providing shelter and food and nourishment, protection from the elements, so that we're going to provide an environment that is safe and nurturing and supportive. We're not doing that to take a sheep and turn it into a dog, which is what parents think they're able to do. We're doing that to provide as good enough of an environment in which that child can grow, develop, prosper, and go on to a fully effective, successful life of meaning. So, what else do shepherds do? They monitor their sheep. We need to monitor our children when they're in the pastures that we supervise, our homes, our yards, our communities and neighborhoods, and monitor them and keep them safe and keep them nourished and prevent them from being victims of the predators out there that want to prey on our sheep, the bullies, the individuals who would abuse our children. We need to protect them from being victimized. Of course, all of these are basic roles of a parent. There's nothing new here other than to understand that it's being done as a shepherd, not as a designer. And of course, focus on healthy nutrition, good nourishment. Understand that our children are going to be prone to obesity as they develop because of their impulsivity and because of the ubiquitousness of high sugar containing foods within our environment, the sort of Western fast food that we have available so much, at least in our country, and make sure that we protect them from these kinds of influences to the degree that we can. Next, we need to start looking for good pastures to provide a high quality, safe, and stimulating environment where we can. And that includes not just inside our home, by the way it's furnished and the toys that we provide and the books and the activities and the routines and so on, but it also means looking at the larger community. As Judith Harris said in her book, The Nurture Assumption, you have more influence on how your child's going to develop and turn out by where you chose to live than by anything you do inside your home, short of abuse, neglect, and malnutrition, which of course are extreme environments that most parents don't provide to their children. In other words, most parents are doing a good enough job, and the rest of what is going to happen is pretty much outside of their control. But provide good pastures where you can, schools and resources and communities and so on. And then focus on your shepherding inside the home, being supportive and caring and stimulating and providing an enriched home environment to the extent that you can. Encourage pro-social behavior. We do influence our children's behavior to some extent by the consequences that we provide. We also influence it by determining the peers that we expose them to and whether they are pro-social or antisocial. And if they are, then we discourage our children's affiliation with such antisocial peers. And if they are drifting, then that we break up those peer relationships where possible when we detect them. And if there's too many of them in our particular environment, then move and seek a better pasture. You will have more influence on your child's outcome by disrupting that kind of criminogenic, antisocial environment and getting to a better one. In addition to that, we can improve pastures by making environmental accommodations for our child's ADHD. And there's a ton of them on my channel and in my books that you can learn about. Make your rules and home life as consistent and predictable as possible, including your routines, your morning routines, your meal routines, your bedtime routines, and sleep hygiene, as we call it. And then manage your child's behavior from sound principles, as I talk about in my book, 12 Principles for Raising a Child or Teen with ADHD. And don't manage them from your reactive emotions of the moment that often gets parents and children into bigger conflicts and difficulties. Of course, get your child's ADHD diagnosed and treated with a combination of our best science-based, evidence-based treatments, such as medications as needed, going through behavioral parent training programs, or reading books like mine. Your Defiant Child is one of my books, if defiance is a problem. My 12 Principles book, Taking Charge of ADHD, another parent's book that I have. It doesn't just have to be my books. There are plenty of good books for parenting an ADHD child out there. And then seek school accommodations, special educational services here in the U.S. if your child qualifies for them, tutoring outside of school if you think that would be beneficial, and so on. There are many treatments for ADHD I've talked about in other lectures on this channel. And then enjoy the show. The rest is largely out of your hands. Stop trying to turn your child into something they're not. You got a sheep, not a cat. Stop trying to change your child to be something they can't and never will be. And if you'll back off and watch and appreciate and value the unique attributes of your child, you'll have a much more peaceful and supportive home life and a much better relationship with this child than if you continue to view your parenting as if you were some kind of an engineer. So sit back, have a glass of wine, watch and enjoy the show. You're going to be raising a very unique individual. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I hope you found this informative. Join me again for other lectures on this channel. If you like our material, recommend us to others. And if you're not subscribed yet, please click on the subscriber button. Thanks again, everybody, and be well.